So again, my name's Dave Fischer. I'm going to go through a couple slides here just to give you a little bit more of a detailed overview of what we're doing. So we are down in Jasper, Indiana, where the big star is at, which is bigger than Jasper itself. But anyways, it's a small town, southern Indiana. We were a conventional farm until about 2004. Then we started selling the meat direct to restaurants across Indiana. So now we've just continued to grow that business to where now we're doing about 30 beef a week and about 80 hogs. The hogs are raised by our neighbors. We also do chicken from millers in northern Indiana, turkey, maple syrup from the Amish, sorghum from the Amish, and so forth. We work with about 22 what we call network farmers, which are raising, most of those are raising cattle for us in some way, shape, or form. Either they're finishing them out for us, raising them as feeder cattle where we buy them, or one of our other finishers buys them, or just grazing our own cows is another part of it. We do have a big USDA Climate Smart project that we kicked off last year, where we're expecting to grow this network farmers to 100 plus and grow the number of beef that we're slaughtering to somewhere around 75 to 90 head a week over the next 5 years. So yes, we're going to be busy. But that's not what you came to hear about. So in 2021, we started a SARE grant on the conversion of some row crop acreage to pasture for Sorghum-Sudangrass. And really, I've been experimenting with Sorghum-Sudangrass probably for about 10 years or so. One of the most amazing things I did with it, I had some right behind my house, and there was a plant. I tied a string to the bottom of the plant so I knew which one it was. And every day for 2 weeks, I went out and measured it. It averaged 5 inches of growth a day during the summer months. This stuff grows like crazy. I mean, and that's just pulling out the leaf and seeing how high it goes. So first of all, I want to talk overall about our annual cycle. So ryegrass is what I can stand here and talk about for 3 or 4 hours, or if you pulled me off to the side. I love my ryegrass. I'll explain more of that later. But it's really on our fields 9 months out of the year, or almost 9 months out of the year. So the green part up there, the yellow part in the middle is the corn time period, right? And we harvest all our corn or silage for our cattle. So what we're looking at is there something we can replace those corn time period with? And we're looking for a lot of different benefits. One of those is just calf health, and the other side of it is to reduce our nitrogen usage. But I'll go through a little bit more about kind of our standard approach right now. So again, right after we harvest the corn silage, we're no-tilling in ryegrass. We do a little clover, a little wheat, oats, turnips and so forth. But ryegrass is really the main staple in that rotation. And what's beautiful is by usually about the 1st of November, this was a little bit earlier this year in 2017, where we will have ryegrass that's 16, 18 inches tall. You can't get your hand down to the ground. It's so thick and tillered out. Really does a good job. One is we'll spread a lot of manure on these fields, and that nitrogen, or ryegrass is a great nitrogen scavenger. It pulls all that into its plant. On a side note there, a neighbor of mine that's a dairy planted this fall. They put on a lot of liquid manure. He went out and just took a swath of that ryegrass, sent it off for analysis. It was 44% protein. It just had all that nitrogen sucked in. And while we're on that real quick, one year I did it to where we harvested the ryegrass early April, I think it was about April 15th maybe. And then I had just put nitrogen on 2 weeks prior to that because the fields were wet and so forth, couldn't get onto it. Went ahead and harvested the ryegrass, thought, well, I just put the nitrogen on, it'll be fine for the regrowth. I got hardly any regrowth. It was yellow. I had to put more nitrogen on because it just, again, it sucked that all up. I protein tested my silage, it was 18%. It just all gone up into the ryegrass. So you have to consider that as you factor in your ryegrass in your rotation. The great thing about putting it on right after corn silage is there's always the debate, well, how much nitrogen should I put on my corn? Well, if you know ryegrass is right behind it, you know it's going to use it up before you get into the winter where it's going to leach it out. So again, I can talk about ryegrass all day. But we do creep graze it all fall. And all winter, we've got probably 250, 300 calves out on it right now. But basically their mothers stay behind in a different paddock. And then we've got a wire. We found out about 42 inches is the right height for the wire. Calves slip underneath that, go to graze in that ryegrass. Really keeps a nice healthy place for the calves, makes them butterball fat. Some people call it creep grazing, but it's a big part of what we do. And you can see then by late March, early April, it's nice and tall, and we're out there ready to, we pull the cows March 15th, and we're ready to chop usually by the middle of April. Now when we actually chop is closer to the middle of May, just because we're waiting for the ground to be right. We're southern Indiana, a lot of clay, heavy soils. We don't want to be out there when it's wet. So again, we're chopping that silage, that ryegrass. We go apply the manure. We got 2 big finishing barns that we have sawdust mixed in with it. And so we're out applying the manure in between each one of these crops. And then we go right back to no-tilling the corn right into that. And you can see the ryegrass stubble that's left behind. And I know this is an organic grain conference, but we do spray Roundup to kill that ryegrass. All right, so that's kind of our typical year. I should say we come back and we chop the corn for silage. And one of the beautiful benefits of this rotation that we're trying to keep is the rooting. And I'm sure this conference talks a lot about soil health. What I've kind of gathered over the years, soil health is all about the roots. How much active roots, how much growth can you get on? Because you're putting organic matter down in the soil, both with the roots actually growing and then decaying, but also the exudates from the roots. So we're doing a separate analysis with our Climate Smart grant, but we believe we're depositing over 1 ton of carbon per acre per year. We've increased organic matters from 2% to 5.5%, and I think it's all because of these roots. So again, we're trying to keep that basic system going. I should say we had a University of Kentucky professor come up and analyze our fields. He went one place where we've got the ryegrass, another place where we haven't started doing that yet, and they were side by side, same previous history, same management before we did 7 years of ryegrass. So on the one part we did 7 years of ryegrass, the other part we left it as fescue pasture, and he compared the two. This is what we had still in the fescue pasture, which is less than 4 inches of topsoil. On the part where we had done the 7 years of ryegrass, manure, corn silage rotation, we had grown that to almost 10 inches of topsoil. Our subsoil went from 14 to 22 inches, and our fragipan got pushed down almost 14 inches. So it's really a huge benefit to us to be improving our soils like this. All right, so again, I tell you all that, but now what are the things we don't like about the corn? One is I need a place for stockers to be grazing. So we do quite a bit of fall calving just because we need a year-round supply of calves for our meat business. So, I'm weaning those calves 1st of June. Now what do I do with them? I got 600-pound calves. If I just put them on a TMR mix, I'm always worried about their health and so forth, and I'd like to have them out there grazing. So that's one big thing I'm looking for. But along those same lines, I want to have 1.5 pounds per day of gain to maintain their marbling. I don't want those calves going out backgrounding, as they call it, just putting them out on fescue or perennial pastures that don't give much of a gain. So what happens is the fat cells in the meat go away and you never get them back. So then you pour a lot of corn to them and you're finishing them. You get the fat across the back, you get the fat in different places, but not in the meat. And our customers want the little fine white lines of marbling in the meat. So anyways, I gotta stay above 1.5 pounds a day of gain. I'd like to see a lower cost than my 80 cents a pound of gain that I get with the corn silage distillers mix that I feed them now as a TMR. And the last thing, which is getting really important for us, is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions with less nitrogen. Okay. So I'll go through 3 different years that we've done this, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do in '24. and probably 25 and 26. So in 21, and again, we had been doing this for 7 or 8 years. We weren't totally novices at this when the SARE grant started, but it really kind of focused our attention on it. We had 120 about 700-pound calves that we divided into 2 groups. One that was going to stay on the silage distillers grains and one that we were going to put on grazing. So we did that, and we followed the general rules on rotational grazing like you would for pastures and so forth. And what we ended up with was a lot of trampling and very little regrowth. And that trampling is probably the #1 issue that we're battling with the Sorghum-Sudangrass. It grows like crazy, but if anybody's had familiarity with it, when the cows go walking across it, especially if they hit it head on, it snaps at the bottom and it's down on the ground. And yes, they may be trampling some of that into the ground for organic matter, but there's a really good book, I can't remember the name of the author anymore, but they did an analysis and they said basically any of this plant material on top, even if you get it in the ground, only 13% of it stays around as persistent organic matter. The roots will be 50%. So the roots stay around in the soil. The plant material is really good to feed the biology, but it's a quick feed. They use it, they provide a lot of nutrients for your plant, but then it's gone. So we're really looking more for that long term. So, trampling those roots into the ground, I'm just not a big fan of trying to do that. Okay. So another thing we tried was strip grazing. So we did this to try to reduce the trampling, and this again was right behind my house, and I moved them for about 3 weeks, 5 times a day. I kept on moving that wire over, and those cattle would come running and all excited, and they would eat, and there was a lot of this competition for eating, which I think is good in a stocker environment, maybe not so good in a cow environment, but in a stocker environment, it was great. Hey, they were eating a lot. The problem was, and you can see it on this slide here, nothing regrew. Those calves would eat that thing down to the ground. There's nothing, and I thought, well, we'll get some action. We got no tillering, we got nothing out of it. So feel free to stop me and ask me any questions as we go along here. So our analysis in 21 was the best we could figure out was about a 3 to 4 acre paddock for these 60 calves. And we did that for about 2 days. But again, you can see how much they just beat it down to the ground. And again, we got better regrowth out of this. As you can imagine, some of those plants that are knocked down there, they're going to stand back up and you'll get more regrowth out of the top. You'll get some tillering, but what I've seen is tillering is not going to make it as far as providing enough tonnage. You really want that growth out of the original plant. Yes?
Do you think you would have had better results if you'd had earlier turnout? I mean,
yeah.
It's a little tall right now.
And that's one of the issues as well, as you probably will. It's so quick to grow, staying on top of that. Like I said, 5 inches a day, and you can't turn it out before about 18, 24 inches because of the nitrate potential. Yeah. And so now you're 24 to 36 might be ideal, but that's 2 days, 3 days. It's real fast to grow out. So I just copied this out of an email. There's a group of us working on this. Cropland Genetics is probably our biggest supporter in this, our local Superior Ag as well. But what we found out from 21 is we really need to spray and kill the ryegrass prior to planting. Even when even when it's hot, the forage sorghum really could not compete with the ryegrass still ready to grow. And you think of it, we either cut or graze that ryegrass, it's ready to snap back out of the ground. We go plant a forage sorghum seed in it. It's going to take 2 weeks or so to get started, and it gets smothered out by the ryegrass. So, one of the issues we had is when we're trying to plant a small amount of seed, and this was really more with the forage sorghum, it's really hard with the drill to get that small of amount of seed coming out. It's just such a tight little narrow opening, and that narrow opening will get clogged. So as I'll explain later, our solution to that has been using a corn planter for forage sorghum. one interesting thing we found when we plant the sorghum Sudan right into the ryegrass row, we had really poor stands. If it was just off an inch one way or the other, we're okay. But right down that row, it didn't want to grow. We also figured out we really do need to spray for broadleaf control. You can use 2,4-D, but you get within the first 12 inches. After the plant's 12 inches tall, we've done before, you'll plant or you'll spray 2,4-D, it looks good, the weeds go away, and then about a week later, the forage sorghum that we did it on starts to curl, and the whole plant will curl, and you won't get near as good regrowth. So the 2,4-D, you've got that to control weeds until the 12 inches. I think that's pretty well most of it. So 2022 was a drought for us. We've had a lot of these kind of mini droughts, but we had a drought from like May 15th to June 30th, 0 rain. So a lot of this we replanted, and I decided to kind of skip directly to 23, where we did a lot better analysis and had a lot better results. But the one thing we did learn in 2022, I bought this corn planter with splitters on it, and we tried planting forage sorghum, and we got a lot better seed placement. You know, with the drill, it's just gonna kind of dribble it out. You have multiple seeds together. With the corn planter, with the plates, we get really good uniform seed spacing, and I felt like the soil to seed contact was a lot higher than in the loose ground from the drill. We got, I know, well over a 90% stand using the corn planter. So we're doing a lot more with that this year. All right, so let's talk about what we did last year, which was, I think, really interesting. So we had a beautiful stand. This was Sorghum-Sudangrass here. This is planted with a drill, this portion of the field. We did about 2/3 of the field with the drill, 1/3 with the corn planter. We did use herbicides to control the weeds. Just a beautiful stand like that. And now we're out there grazing it. We first of all divided it into these strips, about 1 to 2 acres. We had initially about 120 calves on this, which may have been too many as well. But you can see it, one group there starting to graze. There's another, but again, we had that limited regrowth after the bad trampling. So a good friend of mine, Purdue University, who's a grazing expert, was working with us on this, and he would come over and just tell us, you know, it's okay for it to be trampled down like that. You'll get that in the ground, you'll get regrowth and so forth. And I saw, yeah, we got regrowth, but it wasn't enough to support the animals for very long. Okay. And what we really saw too is there were a couple places where my employee who was doing the drilling didn't get the drill right beside it. And so there was like a foot and a half gap, maybe more than that, probably more like 2 foot gap in between one drill and another. And that's where those cattle like to walk, right? And it was actually really good for us to have those walking lanes. So again, here's one day of trampling. The interesting thing, this was, I think, on a Sunday when I let them out, and you can barely see that little wire on the right. I came back that evening, it was all trampled down, and the cattle had let themselves out into the rest of the field. So that Sunday evening, my wife and I were out there looking at it, and we're saying, you know, this trampled down after one day, that's not going to regrow. You know, we're not going to get much out of that. So why don't we just let them into that whole field? So we let them in the whole field. We came back the next day and we did divide it in half. So we had about a 23-acre field. We divided it in half and went that route. And we got some good regrowth. I don't want to share the numbers yet, but we got some regrowth. We got a lot of the cows walking around the grass. We had a nice woods area where they could go lay down, which I think is also critical. You know, when they're not grazing, you don't want them laying down in the Sorghum-Sudangrass. So you got to have another place for them to go. But again, the amount of time we got just wasn't cost effective, and here's the numbers. So again, 23 acres, we had 104 head. Average about 670 pounds, equated to about 3,600 grazing days. which equates to about 160 grazing days per acre. The average gain of about 1.1 pound per day, which was below our target. And again, if we value that at $1.50 per day, it's $240 per acre is the value that we got out of it. So now if you look on the cost side, $75 just for the seed tractor. We had some manure fertilizer we put on. Normally we would put on $50 per acre of nitrogen. You got to figure in the land cost, and now we're at about $325 per acre. So you can see it wasn't as beneficial. If I would do this with corn silage, it totally flips. It's where I'm $600+ an acre in value. So that's what I'm still trying to figure out is how do we get enough grazing days to make this worthwhile? I love it from the cattle health standpoint. With sorghum Sudan, you're still putting a lot of roots into the ground. You're growing very quickly. You're doing a lot of photosynthesis, so it's putting a lot of carbon, but we're not getting those growing days, or grazing days. This is another interesting thing we did last year is we just took the stalks and the leaves and we separated it and we sent it off for analysis. I wanted to know, you hear so much about the sugars in the stalk and the moisture in the stalk, what's really there for growing. And you can look through a lot of these different parts of it. One of the interesting things is the protein percentage was so high, 18 and 23% on a dry matter basis. But the expected gain, and this is all due to that net energy, a lot of times I'm looking at net energy for gain, was pretty low on the stalks, 0.58, pretty high or higher on the leaves. So generally what I want to do is get the calves to eat a lot of leaves. And it's kind of interesting when they go to start eating, they'll eat those leaves, but they will also eat that stalk and just kind of work it down. You notice them out there. So what are we going to do in 24? First of all, our key lessons is both weed control and trampling. To me, that's what it comes down to make this viable. We also had some problems with aphids. This last year we didn't have much. Actually, I think we solved most of it with ladybugs. We bought 2 packages of ladybugs and went out and spread them around in the field, and that seemed to do a pretty good job on them. I've read some things recently where even aphids, you don't see much damage on it. You're still going to get energy impact in the sorghum. So this year we're planting an aphid tolerant variety. We are planting more forage sorghum, and I can go into details on the forage sorghum, what we're doing there. One of the interesting things is we do not let it fully mature out in the field. We cut it when it's right at its leaf stage, so right before the head comes out, and then let it wilt for 1 to 2 days, depending on the moisture in the air and so forth, how fast it's drying down. And then we chop it just like you would any grass pasture. And what I like about doing it that way is, one is you don't get those tiny seeds. I can talk on this for hours, but anyways, those tiny seeds the cows will not digest. We've looked at it, we've looked at their manure, those tiny grain sorghum seeds, the cattle will not get the value out of those. Plus what is more critical is I want that summer crop off by the end of August. So I can be planting my ryegrass, oats, wheats combination and get that fall grazing. So I can plant the stuff 1st of June, forage sorghum, and be chopping by August 15th. Week or so to spread manure, do anything else I went to the field, and still get that planted before the end of August and get some really good regrowth and really good grazing. So that's one of the big things we're shooting for. One other thing we're looking at is planting more multi-species. If anybody's looked at the work that Dr. Chris Touche he did at Virginia Tech, he's got a lot of good videos out there. He has since moved to University of Kentucky, Princeton, which is only about 3 hours from us, and I've connected with him on a lot of this. One of the issues with the multi-species, cowpeas, buckwheat, those kind of things is it's kind of a one graze and you're done. And so what he saw was there's not much value in planting those multi-species. But he, like I, haven't given up yet. We're still experimenting around with it, but we just haven't found anything yet. So one of the crazy things we're going to do this year is to plant forage sorghum and sorghum Sudan in walking lanes for the calves and try to put some legumes in between. And this is kind of what we're talking about. So we're going to take that corn planter probably, although we've had some discussions on this, but do about a 30-inch walking lane to where there's no sorghum Sudan planted so they can walk down that 30-inch. Now what are we going to plant in that 30-inch? Because if we don't plant anything, we're going to have weeds. And we want to get some growth out of that as well. So again, this is where we're talking buckwheats, clover, cowpeas, anything along those lines, just trying to get us maybe a little bit more valuable forage in the mix, but also something for them to easily walk down. And the little white lines on there, see how the cattle move around? Let me see if I can go back here. So he doesn't do it on that slide, does it on this slide. Anyways, you guys get the idea. I think I don't want to cause you all to have seizures. Let me run back to this picture. All right, so on this picture you can see we've got a building up on top there. We've got these scattered throughout our farm. That's where we can feed a TMR mix to the cattle, where they can also come up for shade, and that's where their water is. So our plans for this year is to have a strip along, you can also see the road there, have a strip for the cattle to be able to access different paddocks. But then when they get into that paddock, it's going to be these straight rows in front of them. And what we're hoping what they do is they walk down those straight rows, take a few bite out of the leaves as they're walking along. That plant continues to regrow. And I've really seen that work well. I haven't done the measurements on it, but you can see after a couple days after that plant is eaten, but it's left, it's not down to the bottom, it's not trampled over, you get a lot of regrowth out of that main plant real quick. So that's what we're trying to do, is basically have a nice, I think, forage sorghum, just because of the thickness on the forage sorghum. You get a much thicker stalk. Have that be constantly supplying these leaves for those calves to be grazing as they're walking down those aisles. And then again, to have some place to go to where they're not trampling it down when it gets hot, they're not standing out there. Okay? So that is the bulk. I think that's all. One thing I will say is we've been hosting field days. We normally have about 2 a year. We had 70 farmers attend last year. We've got the pit there on the right side. That's Dina Anderson with the NRCS. She's helped us quite a bit analyzing these roots, trying to figure out what's going on in the soil. Oh, shoot. Try this again. Hopefully you guys can see the top part of it. Don't look at the bottom. But anyways, we are continuing with this Climate Smart project to try to get more and more producers. I'm going to take that off there because I'm sure it's distracting for you guys. We're trying to get more and more producers to help work with us to grow cattle for us. We're looking in southern Illinois, southern Indiana, Kentucky region. We like to be within about a 4-hour drive of our farm to produce cattle. So if anybody knows anybody in those areas, and anybody's welcome obviously to attend our field days as well if you want to see more of this, hands-on. We'll probably do one again somewhere in August, and we'll probably have one again in April for the cover crop. We've got a bunch of different cover crop plots that we've planted. Alrighty. Well, that's my official presentation. If anybody's got any questions on this or our meat business or anything else, I'm happy to answer. Yes?
Have you tried any other germination methods for the ryegrass, and how those are going?
We've tried, our main method is to basically cut and then chop. I've seen that to be the best method as far as getting then the corn or the subsequent crop to come up. I have tried to where I'll do that. I'll graze it for a little while and then just try to wait until it's hot, wait till it's above 85 degrees generally when ryegrass doesn't want to grow. But as I mentioned in here, it still wants to come back enough to where it tramples out that, or it smothers out the next crop. yeah, I'm open to suggestion, but crimping does not work on ryegrass. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Given the higher value of row crop land, how does the economics work out when you're switching over to this forage grazing system?
Yeah. And it's a tough sale. I mean, we've got the capability to make silage, and basically corn silage and distillers grains is a very cheap alternative. So financially it doesn't yet. But like I said, I haven't given up on it, because if we, the tremendous growth that it produces, if we can just get the cattle a little bit more efficient in harvesting it, I think it can eventually beat corn silage. And when you do that, though, you also get the added benefit of the calves' health. I think it's so much better when they're out there grazing than when we've got them up around a TMR pad. And quite frankly, the third part is just marketing. We hold a lot of restaurant tours all summer long. And when the restaurant comes, they don't want to see fields of corn, they want to see cows out grazing. And so that's one of the motivations for doing it as well.
Do you get premium prices for your beef then?
Oh yeah. We do, for a lot of different reasons. Main thing is quality. At the end of the day, people want something that tastes good, is what we figured out. So that's our number one selling point, is still quality, and then that it's clean. We're not doing any growth hormones and so forth. We're not adding anything during the processing. And down at the bottom someplace, as far as we routinely poll our customers, ask them why they buy our stuff, and down at the bottom is the sustainability aspects of it. But you really have to look at each customer and the reason that each customer is buying. So we supply Indiana University with their meat for their dorms. They are all about sustainability. They wouldn't be buying from us unless they felt we were putting in sustainable practices. But it's also got to be good quality. All right. And yes?
I'm not sure if you covered this already, but did you talk about your pilots and moving your animals around and how the duration by which you do that?
Yes. That was kind of the bulk of the presentation, but it's basically 3 to 4 acre paddocks is probably the one that we've seen work best so far. But we're really switching to where we're trying to get them to walk down rows and eat it as they walk down rows. Okay. But we've tried everything from 1 acre with 120 cattle to 10 acres with 120 cattle, and 3 to 4 seems to be about the best that we're able to do right now. But like I said, we're hoping to graze it in rows and see how that works. Yes.
With your plan for this coming year, you mentioned shade before when you had it divided into the large paddocks.
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to address that?
Right. Luckily, our farm is very rolling hills. All right. So at the end of every hill, there's a woods. Right. So we can have it to where, like on the picture I was showing, the cattle can come into the barn. On the opposite end of the field, they can get afternoon shade as well from the trees there that they can't get into, but it shades them. So we tried to divide up the paddocks to where we have enough for the days above 90 degrees. Our rule of thumb is above 90 degrees, you got to have shade for the cattle. And so we'll, based on looking at the weather forecast, we'll put them in the ones that don't have shade when it's cool and the ones that do when we need to. Yes?
What is your average stocking rate end up being?
Boy, that's a tough question. Just because I really wasn't looking at that as much. Quite frankly, I mean, we tried, I said 104 calves on an acre. We tried 104 calves on 3 to 4 acres. We tried that on 12 acres and so forth. So.
The reason I ask is because I ran out my ground, and it's usually based on the stocking rate, how many animal units per acre. And so far, all my tenants have grazed, and it's just,
Yeah.
uh,
Is it perennial pasture?
it is.
Yeah. Just for that, we shoot for about 1 cow per acre on perennial pastures with no calf. If they got a calf, we'll back it down based on, the weather and how big the calves are and so forth. But generally, if somebody's got 50 acres, I'll tell them we can run 50 cows on it. That helps you. But that's got to be good pasture and it's got to be rotated. We shoot to rotate at least 5 times a week. They got to be out there managing it to make that happen. Yes?
You said you have hogs as well. Is that the same setup on them, or?
No, we don't have hogs. Our neighbor has hogs. They're raised mostly in confinement.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not out there pasturing pork.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yes?
I did some rotational grazing with sheep, and one problem I always run against was I wanted one to eat a little further down the stalk. So I'm curious if that's something you're running into, or if you've been able to.
Yeah, our issue has been more that with sorghum Sudan, that they eat too far down the stalk. They eat the growing point. Once the growing point's gone, all you get is some tillering. So that is, I'd like to see them eat some of the stalk, but not all the way down to the ground.
Do you think you're increasing rotating them and reducing them out per acre? Do you think that's going to be a good mitigation strategy?
I'm sorry, I don't know if I understood.
I was basically asking, do you think this new system that you're thinking of for 2024 is going to mitigate that issue?
It'll help, I think, more with the trampling.
Okay.
That's our biggest issue, and you can see some of these slides like that. When I look at that, and there's pretty low utilization. And again, my Purdue friend, who's all about rotational grazing and does a phenomenal job with a lot of the pastures, he says that's okay, and I look at it and say that's not okay. I'm not getting the utilization I need to make it cost justifiable. Yes.
Outside of, you said ryegrass and sorghum, have you tried the other kind of extended rotation that would not work?
For like perennial forages,
Either way, that or like just a series of annual crops.
yes, as far as I'm always experimenting with things to plant over the winter months. And like I said, we've probably got 20 different plots right now that we're experimenting with those. I haven't found anything to beat ryegrass. And so I try to stay open to that. I try not to be too dogmatic in my approach. But then in the summertime, I'm open to suggestions as for what else we can plant. I've thought about teff, but everything I hear about teff is it's just a shorter time period. That's what everybody says is don't mess with it. So yeah, I'm open, and if anybody's got any suggestions on what else we can put in a mix, I'm very open to try something else.
And the other thing I had was, does most of the manure that you spread, does that come from your own cows or from around?
Yeah, the manure comes from our own cattle. We've got about 300 in our finishing barn at any one time that are standing there in sawdust, and so we're spreading the mix of the sawdust and manure out on the fields, which gives us a lot of carbon that we're putting out with that. Interesting thing on that is we don't get much nitrogen benefit initially from putting that out because the nitrogen's breaking down the sawdust. But future years you'll get it. As you increase that organic matter, we're counting on a good 60 to 70 pounds per acre of nitrogen for both of our crops every year. It's kind of interesting. In our initial climate smart analysis, we basically figured out it's come down to 3 things. It's the enteric emissions of the cattle, it's the nitrogen fertilizer that we're putting on, and then we buy grain, so it's the nitrogen fertilizer that the cattle are putting on are the main things with our carbon footprint. The nitrogen with the nitrous oxide cycle, and it's 300 times worse than carbon dioxide and so forth. So we're really targeting how can we reduce that purchased nitrogen and any nitrous oxide going up in the air. All right. Yes?
So I came in just a tick late, so if you mentioned this, I apologize.
That's right.
But what breed are you working with?
Mostly Angus. We do a cross with Shorthorn. That's just what we found for our best quality. And then within Angus, we've got some parameters that we look at pretty heavily as well. All right. Yes?
Not a technical question, but in thinking of your operation and other farms that might be interested in climate smart initiatives, I'm curious, how do you see policy playing into that? How do you see policy playing into that?
I really like the approach of looking at the current climate smart projects, which there are 70 larger ones, which we are, and then there's 70 smaller ones. I view them all, and I think the USDA does, as pilot projects. We're out there doing on-farm research. Some of them are more university-based, some of them are bigger company-based, and so forth. So we're doing what I like to consider on-farm pilot project research, both on the farm as well as what is the customer interested in, and doing a lot of market research and so forth. So after we start figuring some things out, we're on the hook to publish 2 white papers on the carbon sequestration. And we've got a team that's working with us. Geospherics out of Bloomington, Indiana, is doing all that research. We've done 84-foot deep probes now, where we are comparing how much carbon we've got in the ground after we do this process for 3 years, 7 years, 15 years. And that's how we're getting that kind of data. It's really interesting. Also, we're comparing that with the carbon that's in the woods. And everybody thinks that you see these beautiful trees and they're pulling in all this carbon. Well, they are, but they're putting that carbon in the leaves. The leaves are falling on the ground, and then all winter long, that carbon's going back up in the air. It's not going down into the ground. And that's, again, why I see it really takes the roots. Now, the woods has the benefit of that tree growing every year. And so you're depositing that carbon, if you will, for a short time in that wood. But when you harvest that wood, now what happens to that? You've got to track that as well. But what we've seen is we're able to beat the carbon that's in our woods after just about 10 years of this rotation. Even though the ground has been destroyed by the settlers who came in the 1830s and then tilled it, and my dad, who's 92, can still remember how they would be out there on a plow with a horse and then a disc, and then they would plant it, and then they would cultivate it 5 times a year, leaving that soil really, really loose. And on our hillside, they lost a lot of topsoil over the years. All right, and you can, our website is ffnatural.com. We've got all kinds of things out there on that as far as, we'll go from there. All right.
Yep.